Well, with that, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us this month for another Food Policy Debrief Substack Live. Last month, if you were with us or if you saw the recording, you know that we talked um, largely about the issues facing millennial and Gen Z and young people and how they can advocate for themselves in the issue facing them. But what about older adults? A lot of people think that baby boomers and the silent generation, which came before them, are awash in cash and retirement accounts and pensions. But that simply isn't the case for many older adults in this country. In fact, nearly 14 million Americans over the age of 60 struggle with hunger every year, and over half report feeling isolated or lonely. That's where awesome organizations like Meals on Wheels America and its members come in. May is Older Americans Month. So, our guest is my friend Josh Protas, who's the Chief Advocacy and Policy Officer at Meals on Wheels America. There, he oversees all the advocacy campaigns and initiatives designed to support and strengthen the nationwide network of senior nutrition programs and the individuals they serve. Josh is responsible for building partnerships and coalitions and represents Meals on Wheels America and local providers before Congress, like he did last week, the administration, anti hunger and aging advocates, and other audiences. In short, Josh works each and every day to raise awareness about the issues of senior hunger and isolation and turn Meals on Wheels' vision of an America in which all seniors live nourished lives with independence and dignity into a reality. Josh was also previously the vice president of public policy at Mazone, a Jewish response to hunger, and before that worked for decades in Jewish organizations, which we'll talk a little bit at the very end. So, welcome, Josh. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Will. Great to be with you. Man, I sound old. Worked for decades. I guess I'm not 30 after all.
You are not 30 after all, but it is Older Americans Month. And even though we don't quite fit the 60 plus threshold for the Older Americans Act, if we're lucky, we will get there someday, right?
I'm knocking at the door. I'm getting there pretty soon. I've already got my AARP card, so I'm part of that extended demographic.
Hey, and so do I as an employee there. We won't ask you what your favorite discount is today, but we'll get there eventually, right?
Yes.
All right. So, as I mentioned, May is designated by the Department of Health and Human Services as Older Americans Month. In your work, you represent the thousands of organizations providing nutrition to seniors across the country. So, what are some of the issues facing America's seniors? And what's something people get wrong about food insecurity among older adults?
Well, first of all, Will, thanks for doing the Substack Live on this topic. I think one of the challenges for older adults in this country writ large is that their needs are largely invisible or overlooked and certainly not prioritized. And we certainly feel that very acutely when we're talking about Meals on Wheels support and the issue of food insecurity for older adults. Um, but I think it's not just that policymakers tend to overlook the needs of this community, but society as a whole.
Hmm.
When we look at philanthropic giving, it's less than 1% that goes towards senior focused causes, which
Wow.
is shocking. And it's particularly shocking when you look at the demographic shift that is happening in this country. So that
Mhm.
lack of attention for the needs of seniors um, really is counter to how it should be because we're moving toward an American population that has more seniors than young adults pretty soon. We have 60,000 people every day. I'm sorry, 12,000 people every day who turn 60 years old in
Mhm.
this country. So it's a rapid shift that's happening. And as a society, we really haven't accounted for that. We haven't made the investments in the infrastructure and the systems at the scale that's necessary. And unfortunately, it means that we're really going to be scrambling to try and address more acute needs, many of which could be prevented if we invested in more proactive interventions and to the point about food insecurity and Meals on Wheels programs, we often make the case that it it's not making the case, I mean, it's just sharing the simple fact that it is a smart investment. It's smart fiscal policy to be able to support an older adult by providing them the nutritious meals that they need to live healthily, independently in their own homes and keep them out of more costly emergency room settings, hospitalizations, nursing home placements. And so I think, well, I don't even remember what your question was, but I think it was about what Americans get wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's that we just don't see the extent of the needs for this community. And in your lead in, you talked about, I think the wrong assumptions that there's an abundance of wealth among older adults, and that's certainly true for some. But that is not universally the case. 1 in 2 older adults who live alone lack the income to cover their basic needs. I mean,
Mhm.
that's horrifying in today's America, in the wealthiest country in the world. That is reality. The fastest growing demographic of the unhoused community, the unhoused population, are older adults, and you think about how tragic that is for people who've worked their whole lives, they've given to society, and then in their twilight years, they may be facing just extreme struggles to make ends meet and maybe out on the streets or scrambling to just try and take care of their basic needs.
Yeah.
That
I've
shouldn't be the
mhm.
case.
No, it shouldn't, and I've also seen, um in the past week or so, I read a paper, I think by Brookings, talking about how more and more older adults are now caregivers for their grandchildren, even
Yeah.
because their children are so, pressed. And so often, grandparents become primary caregivers for grandchildren, even. And so that's another way in which, this group of people is being squeezed. Um, Something that you mentioned that I want you to dive into a little bit more. And as full disclosure for those who don't know, one of my first, big advocacy jobs was at Meals on Wheels America, 13, uh, maybe 14 years ago. And so, Josh, you mentioned about the costs, right? And so, um, give us a little bit more of, show us under the hood a little bit more about what those costs look like, just very briefly. We're talking about, you know, providing a meal to someone in their home.
Mhm.
Um, you know, what kind of medical costs do those help prevent?
Sure. So, to take a step back and to look at like what the costs are, um, Meals on Wheels programs, and when we talk about Meals on Wheels, that's commonly known, but the truth is that senior nutrition providers are often providing home delivered meals and congregate meals or community-based meals.
Mhm.
So they're meeting the needs of seniors where they are. And while there have been Meals on Wheels programs in this country for more than 60 years, they've formally been supported through the Older Americans Act going back to 1972 when the nutrition program was added. And since that time, Meals on Wheels programs, and I'll use Meals on Wheels, but know that I'm talking about senior nutrition programs more broadly. They're really a fantastic example of a successful public-private partnership. So it's not a benefit that's completely federally supported. It's about a third of the funding that comes through the federal government through the annual appropriations process that supports the Older Americans Act nutrition program, and that helps to leverage state and local and private contributions. So currently, the federal government is paying a little over $1 billion annually. That helps to provide 244 million meals to roughly 2.6 million individuals. Um, and that is vital and important. And there are an estimated 2.5 million low income, food insecure, older adults in need who our programs are not reaching. Right.
Mm,
So that's almost double what the program is serving. So So that federal investment, that $1 billion, is important, and a lot more is needed. Our ask in the FY27 appropriations process is $2.285 billion, which is the amount that we've calculated it would take for the federal portion to be able to serve all low income, food insecure older adults in need.
Yeah.
And so, like you asked the question about kind of the cost. So, um, we can provide those Meals on Wheels services to a senior for an entire year for
Hmm.
roughly the same cost as 1 day in a hospital or 12 days in a nursing home. And we know that by providing those services, it's not only the nutritious meals that comply with the dietary guidelines and the daily required intake amounts specific for older adults, but it's also that point of social connection, sometimes that only human connection that a senior may have in the course of a day or even a week. Um, and it's also the safety and wellness checks and those referrals to other supportive services that, again, help to keep a senior at home where they want to be. Um, if you look just at the issue of social isolation, I think the annual costs to Medicare for social isolation and loneliness, which have been declared an epidemic,
Hmm.
is around $9 billion a year.
Wow.
That's 4 times what our total ask is for appropriations,
Right.
for senior nutrition program funding. So we can make a small targeted investment, small in the, the bigger picture of federal budget, um,
Hmm.
upfront, or pay a lot more in downstream costs. If you look at, falls, I think that's what, 90 is it $90 million a year, or 90 billion a year or more. If you look at diet related health conditions, I mean, all of these things, malnutrition, they're multiple times what the investment in senior nutrition programs should be. And so if we could head off a lot of those preventable conditions, or at least delay them, we wind up not only saving those seniors, a lot of grief and hardship and out of pocket costs, but their families and caregivers those costs, and taxpayers too.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I remember we talked about back in the day, was just about how, you mentioned a lot of costs of loneliness, you mentioned the cost of diet-related, diseases, especially among older adults, and not only is it cost to, individual families who have to pay for caregiving, it also, is a stress on programs. So long-term care isn't necessarily covered by Medicare, but obviously, much of individuals' primary care specialists are covered. But if they need long-term care in a nursing home, they often have to turn to Medicaid, which in many states involves, families having to discharge assets over a look-back period, for eligibility, and then Medicaid having to cover those long-term care costs. And so in a situation where now we see some of the HR1 changes happening with cost sharing in Medicaid in particular, and also in these nutrition programs, where basically we're not just kicking the can down the road on nutrition spending, we're setting up a perfect storm later where we have all these costs that can't necessarily be covered, for long-term care and diet-related illnesses.
And it's not only the costs, but we have the opportunity to save tremendous drain on overburdened institutions. So you think about
Mm,
hospital systems, but in particular rural hospitals that may not
yeah,
have enough beds, or nursing homes in communities where they don't have adequate staffing. If we can help to keep seniors who don't need to be hospitalized, who don't need to be in a nursing home, it's not only the cost of that, but it's also freeing up that space so that those institutions, those agencies can operate more effectively, and they're being pulled apart right now.
yeah,
And we'll probably talk a little bit about some of the impacts of HR1, but I think hospital systems are certainly feeling that, a lot of threats to hospitals, particularly in rural communities. And so this is another way that we could help to support those hospitals, in addition to reducing costs.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, we as you mentioned, some people know the term Meals on Wheels, But as you've alluded to, Meals on Wheels programs do a lot more than just provide meals, to people at their home, right? So, could you give our audience a brief overview of some of the things, MOA and its members are doing on a daily basis in virtually every corner of the country? You mentioned, obviously meal delivery, checking in on people, neighbor to neighbor, volunteer to, program client. But you also mentioned that they refer to other services. So give us a picture of what Meals on Wheels providers are doing across the country.
Yeah, well, so I'll first start by saying, my connection to Meals on Wheels was through my grandmother.
Mm.
I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and my grandmother, who was legally blind her entire adult life, received Meals on Wheels. That was an just a helpful additional supportive service. So my grandmother could do a little bit of cooking, but not a lot of cooking for herself. So the meals were extremely helpful. But it was also those volunteer drivers who became friends and almost like family.
Mhm.
And those were people who were regular eyes and ears. And this is the case for the seniors that they visit. They earn the trust of the older adults that they provide the meals to. They're able to enter the home and to just look at the surroundings and identify, hey, is there a potential risk of a fall here? Would it be helpful for there to be bathroom railings or to remove rugs that are bunching up and could be a fall risk? And to be able to make referrals to help to get those things done. Maybe there's some in-home support that might be necessary, and the Older Americans Act nutrition program that operates within a larger context of the Older Americans Act, and should just kind of mention that so people may know the
Talk more about.
People may know the Older Americans Act kind of broadly. One of the things that the OAA did was create what we know of as the aging network. So, state
Mhm.
units on aging, area agencies on aging within states that contract out for services. And it's really been an effective infrastructure for addressing like the whole person needs of seniors. So often assessments are done by these AAAs, the area agencies on aging, and they
Mhm.
might identify what kinds of benefits or services would be helpful. In
So to kind of back up for a second,
Yeah,
what and just to maybe explain for our audience a bit, because I know what you're talking about, but
I know, and I
uh,
live in these weeds too much. So
exactly, but our audience might not know this. So basically what happens is the federal government appropriates money for the Older Americans Act programs. HHS sends it to, you mentioned, state units on aging. So these are state agencies that are in charge of aging programs throughout the country, right? And then they divvy out those funds to area agencies on aging. Um, and so correct me in this description if you feel like it's inaccurate, but area agencies on aging feel like care hubs for several communities for older adults, and providing them the services that they need. AAAs can also provide those services themselves, or they can contract out to, a program that's just delivering meals or a program that's just doing falls prevention, things like that. Is that your understanding, Josh?
that's right, and I'd also
Okay.
say that, like, for state units on aging, they come up with state plans, for
Mhm.
aging, and so it's not only that there's the conveyance of federal funds, and those typically follow formulas that flow based on population of older adults,
Mhm.
but there's an intentional forward-reaching planning, that's trying to take into account demographic changes, societal changes, what the needs of older adults are, and to plan for those, and to try to proactively look at how to implement and meet those needs. Now, unfortunately, we've been in the situation for a while now where there's a chronic underfunding by the federal government. So it's great to plan for things and to have, you know, big audacious goals, but you also have to have the resources to do that, and we've certainly felt that in the nutrition space where there's been a chronic underfunding that has led to spiraling unmet need. I mean, it really is a crisis of seniors in need of nutrition and social connection who just aren't getting the support and services that they need and deserve. And let me just say something about deserving.
Mhm. Because that's a kind of a tough word, right?
Well, I don't think it needs to be. I mean, I am of the mind that that the role of our federal government is to make sure that the needs of our friends, neighbors, family members are taken care of. That there's a fulfillment of our collective responsibility to each other, and that we deserve that kind of support. That should almost be an entitlement, something that when we find ourselves in need, there are programs there, and we certainly have some programs that are
Yeah.
formally designated as entitlement programs that you may qualify for based on income levels or other criteria of need. But there are other programs that don't, in that classic formulation of what an entitlement program is, fall into that. But I think um, the America that I'd like to live in, that I'd like to imagine we are in terms of values, is one where people who are in need, they're deserving of care and support, and
Yes.
that shouldn't be called into question.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I we're gonna pivot to talking a little bit more about the structure of the Older Americans Act, but you mentioned, this, maybe that this Meals on Wheels or Older Americans nutrition should be an entitlement, right? But currently, the way the Older Americans Act works is more about targeting language and not language that qualifies you or disqualifies you. Can you tell me a little bit more about, and our audience more about, that targeting language and how it's well intended but maybe creates some of these gaps?
Yeah, the Older Americans Act, I mean, it has a language to direct services toward those in greatest social and economic need. And that often gets translated at a local community level because need might look different in New York City than it does in Chinle, Arizona, or lots of variations. And
Right.
so there's some determination at a community level of who is in greatest need. Now, greatest economic need is easier in some ways to quantify.
Mhm.
You can identify people who are food insecure, who are at or below the poverty level, or at some gradation of that.
Yeah.
Social need has become. I'm not saying that it is, but it has become more politicized and more contentious
Mhm.
in interpretations of that. But that has been seen to include individuals in rural and remote communities who may live further away from available services. It
Mhm.
includes older adults who are non-English. English isn't their primary language.
Mhm.
Um, it has included other communities that have been marginalized, including LGBTQ older adults.
Mhm.
Um, that last part has become more politicized. Um,
Yeah.
so, you know, for the Older Americans Act program, I think to maybe more effectively realize its intent and purpose might be to make services um, entitlements,
Mhm.
where there's not constant annual scrapping for funding, where then
Mhm.
tough decisions have to be made because there's a mentality of scarcity, because there's inadequate funding, and so tough decisions have to be made about who is most, quote, "deserving."
Yeah.
Um, the it would be ideal not to be in that kind of constant scrapping, and I would sometimes on the Hill will invoke as a comparison, another program that's not an entitlement program, but this, the WIC program, the Special Supplemental Program for Women, Infants, and Children.
Yeah.
And the WIC program is a really important program that provides vital nutrition to people in the early years of their life or early, times for their family development. And routinely, there has been bipartisan support to fully fund WIC.
Mhm.
Fully fund, meaning like to provide adequate funding so that there aren't wait lists.
Right.
And
We
and
know what the size of the need, and so we're going to meet that need.
right. Now, it hasn't always been exactly perfect in
Sure.
the but Congress has lived up to the task of coming up with funding. Sometimes it's at the last minute, an emergency measure, but
Uh-huh.
they fully fund the WIC program so that there's not a wait list. For senior nutrition programs, as a country, we've been fully comfortable having wait lists, having long wait lists.
Mhm.
So currently, 1 in 3 Meals on Wheels providers has a wait list. Average wait time 4 months, in some cases 2 years or longer. And so
Yeah.
why this is okay? It WIC should never have a wait list, but neither should senior nutrition programs.
Right.
And
Right.
so there's something broken in a system where we have to vie for annual appropriations, but those appropriations come nowhere close to the level of need, and
Yeah.
toward rapidly growing need with the population shift, and then really escalating costs, and those are acutely felt right now with the war with Iran and the higher fuel prices that everybody's
Yep.
feeling. I was in Florida a couple of weeks ago with Meals on Wheels programs there, and a program leader told me that in the previous week alone, he lost 5 volunteers because of
Oh,
gas prices, because these are people who are paying out of their pocket to volunteer, and they
yeah.
just
Yeah.
couldn't do it anymore. So these escalating prices, they not only impact lower income seniors who may have trouble affording groceries, but then it's compounded by the challenges for local programs that can't keep up with the rising fuel prices, the food prices that are only going to continue to escalate, in program operations.
Yeah.
So I've probably gone way past whatever the question was initially, but
Well, I was gonna say a couple of things, from my own experience. I remember, a decade and a half ago almost, going up to the Hill and saying, "Hi, I'm from," it was Meals on Wheels Association of America then, and they'd go, "Oh, yeah, you guys are under USDA, right?" And we had to be like, "No, separate program, like, completely, different thing." And so I think a lot of people think, "Oh, well, we have SNAP, we have WIC, like, problem solved, friends." And kind of forget that Meals on Wheels is there and where it's situated and which approps bill it's even on.
Or
And
or or
so
they kinda love the idea of it, but they don't really know anything about it, and they certainly don't know that there's a lot of unmet need. So they
yeah.
just have this perception that, "Oh, you're okay, like Meals on Wheels, you're good."
Well, and also, like, kinda to go back to our earlier point, like, well, you have Social Security and Medicare, what problems could you have? And that is not the case, right?
Yeah,
I
right.
also think something, you talk about WIC, and, I think there's this tendency, especially in policy, um, sometimes to, like, divide and conquer and play, age politics and generational politics, and I think one of the things that I have always tried to think about, no matter where I'm working in kind of the food system or advocacy, is that, you know, older adults are part of families, kids are part of families, babies are part of families. Um, Kids in the school nutrition program are families. Like single people who are on SNAP are part of families in some way. And so it's a whole life perspective of this, right? And even when you get into older age, there is a spectrum of interventions that you can get before you are qualified for Older Americans Act services, right? Which is why it's important that now, the SNAP work requirements being up to age 64, if people can't get SNAP when they're 55, you know, what's going to happen to their health when they are 60 and eligible for the Older Americans Act programs. It might be even worse
Right.
than it was since they didn't have SNAP. So all of these programs might serve different audiences and have different structures and funding, but they all are serving an important population health goal of reducing food insecurity and increasing nutrition security. And you can play age age warfare all you want, but at the end of the day, everybody's part of a family here, and we're all taxpayers. Um,
And shouldn't everybody in this country have access to nutritious food? Like, shouldn't there
right,
be a right to that?
right.
I think so. I think that that's kind of a minimum thing that we should ensure, and it benefits us all
Mhm.
when our friends, neighbors, family members don't have to struggle to put food on the table, to put healthy food on the table. So across age demographics, yeah, that would be an important human right to be recognized, but we're unfortunately far from that.
Well, in the meantime, since we can't can't well, we have let's just say we haven't yet established a right to food in this country. In the meantime, we still have the Older Americans Act. Um, Obviously, you've mentioned some things about funding, and so, for those of us in our audience who are new to appropriations, advocacy, summer is prime time, so you could probably check out Meals on Wheels America's website and see some, great advocacy materials for appropriations, so we encourage you to check those out if you feel passionately about this issue. But there's also the Older Americans Act and its structure. So, what are some ways that the Older Americans Act beyond being an entitlement, which we've kind of mentioned, what are some other ways that the Older Americans Act structure could be improved to help providers across the country deliver meals, whether it's home delivery or congregate meals to older adults?
Yeah, so the Older Americans Act, and so this is in the weeds a little bit about the way federal legislation works. So there's the annual appropriations process, which funds programs,
Uh-huh.
and then there's the authorizing language, which is the Older Americans Act itself. And the Older Americans Act typically gets reauthorized, or it's supposed to be around every 5 years, and
Right.
we are overdue for a reauthorization. There was a bipartisan bicameral agreement at the end of 2024 that just fell away, be because of politics.
Are you implying that Congress made a promise that they didn't intend to keep?
I think there's still an opportunity for Congress to do the right thing. So that
Very well.
bicameral, bipartisan
Right,
agreement
right,
has
yes.
been reintroduced in the Senate. We'd love to try and see that get done, and that reauthorization helps to just give some certainty to program structure. There's some things from the Meals on Wheels America perspective that we didn't see included in that bipartisan agreement, and so something I'll just name that has been a growing challenge for our network has been um, rising competition from for-profit providers,
Hmm.
and um, want to, if I can have the liberty of just speaking to this for a minute,
Mhm, I have my own thoughts too, so go ahead.
articulate kind of what the challenge is. And there's there are places in America where there are not viable community-based organizations that may be able to fulfill contracts and provide services.
Yeah.
But in the vast majority of communities, and the Meals on Wheels America network is 5,000 plus local community-based organizations that are invested in their communities. They're
Mhm.
involved in their communities. They know their communities. These are organizations that have been serving older adults in their communities for decades and are well positioned to do that. And when for-profit providers come in and take away contracts from these community-based organizations, um, there are a couple of things that are reason for alarm. So,
Okay.
um, Oftentimes, these are companies, they may be national companies, maybe even international, or certainly in many cases, owned by private equity,
Hmm.
that have a purpose of maximizing profit for shareholders. They
And and
are,
and what happens when we maximize profit for shareholders, Josh?
well, I'm not sure exactly where you're going. There's
Well, maybe you were already going there, but continue.
well, so what happens in these scenarios is often that these companies that are from another location altogether, they're
Mhm,
able to low bid on a contract for nutrition services, and oftentimes they are providing frozen meals that are drop shipped. So maybe a week's worth of meals are just dropped on the front porch of a senior.
mhm,
So, what's missing from that equation that's different than what a community based Meals on Wheels provider offers is any of that social connection, any of those referrals to other supportive services, the safety and wellness checks. So, you can low bid for a contract if you're not providing the same thing.
mhm,
This is not apples to apples. And so there's a loss for what's offered to that senior in that situation. And by the way, for an older adult who may be getting home delivered meals, they may not have the physical ability to stand for long, to prepare meals. So
mhm.
even lifting a batch of frozen meals from the front porch may be overwhelming and
Yeah,
undoable for them. So
yeah.
so there's that constraint. But in the longer term, then you have a bigger challenge for the community. So if that community-based organization is displaced because they've lost a contract, they may go out of business, and then you may no longer have a community-based organization that's focused on meeting the needs of seniors. Well, as soon as that contract is no longer profitable for the corporation, it's easy for them to leave town, and you know that they will because their goal is to maximize profits.
Mhm.
Well, when they leave town, then they have left an eviscerated infrastructure, and that will be very difficult to have to rebuild. So, while there may be a short-term desire to work with a contractor that can provide meals at a lower cost, um, it's not providing the full degree of services, and it weakens the aging network infrastructure. And by the way, the Older Americans Act expressly articulates goals that are not only around the nutritional needs of seniors, but also the social isolation,
Mhm.
addressing that as well. So, if we really want to fulfill the intent of the Older Americans Act, we need to make sure that contracts for services extend it to the full degree of what seniors need.
Yeah. I have, a bevy of thoughts about these, private providers. I mean, and like you said, like in some places, last mile delivery is really hard and impossible. And so there are some places where these for-profit providers do, provide a service that community-based orgs can't, right?
And there are some community-based organizations that may not have the ability to operate their own kitchen, and so they may come. So there is a
Yeah.
role
Right.
a role, absolutely. The concern is, though, when community-based organizations get displaced.
Especially if they already exist and have, decades of support and volunteers, and you lose a lot more than just a meal delivery program.
That's right.
Um, I and a way to check in on people and all of that. You know, I remember when I worked at Food and Friends, which is a medically tailored meal provider, which is similar to, but different to Meals on Wheels. Though we did certainly serve many older adults. Um, uh, we had many clients that when they first enrolled with us, we would do mostly fresh, but then also some frozen meals. Um, and there would be households that didn't have a microwave. And so there was no way that like a for-profit provider wouldn't necessarily go home deliver a microwave to them the next time and get it set up in their apartment and get it set up in a way where we knew that they could access it and use it. You know, certain companies, name redacted, just, okay, well, it's a box. We don't care that it's 2 weeks of meals. And it might be a 45-pound box that, you know, an older person can't pick up. Um, or, then has to call for help and then it's outside a 2-hour food safety window. There are all sorts of these other concerns that pop up when it's just kind of plonking a box on a doorstep.
Yeah.
Um, and I've talked to some folks in the healthcare space, one of whom mentioned that when, his mom died, he opened up a freezer and found that there were just tons of these meals from a private provider that she had never touched because she hated them, but didn't tell anyone.
Yeah, and
So
the meals have to, they have to comply with the dietary guidelines, but they also have to be desirable, right? Like, they don't do
right,
any good if the person in need won't eat them.
right, exactly. Well, with that, we mentioned private equity. We've mentioned the dark side of money. But now, some of our readers and some of our viewers might have seen that philanthropist Mackenzie Scott recently made a $70 million donation to Meals on Wheels of America. So now we're at the bright side of money and philanthropy. It's a huge testament to the work that your entire organization and its members do. And we know this gift will be put to good use. But tell us about how a gift of this size can make structural changes and how you all are. I'm sure that there's a lot of planning going on about how best to use this gift, but what are some of the ways that, you're eyeing to help make structural changes in addition to making important investments in the network?
Yeah. So, first of all, to say we are deeply grateful for this, I mean, truly extraordinary act of generosity and
Mhm,
trust, which it demonstrates a powerful vote of confidence in Meals on Wheels, America's mission, its leadership, the incredible work that the nationwide network has done. So that is just tremendous, and
mhm.
um, we take it is there's a lot of responsibility that comes with this. So with that trust, there's a responsibility to steward this investment thoughtfully in order to best maximize its impact. We could so $70 million is an enormous amount.
Yes.
And in context, right? Like I talked about annual budget for the Older Americans Act Nutrition Program is $1 billion with
Uh-huh.
more than $1 billion that is needed to be able to serve all seniors in need. So,
So suddenly 70 million looks like budget dust.
right. So thinking about we're trying to be thoughtful in a phased approach to try and help to meet some immediate needs that exist, but also looking to leverage some sustainable and long-term change that will enable network providers to be more effective in the long run. So that also means we need to have the federal resources that increase, to meet that need too. And
Mm,
so we're really looking thoughtfully at kind of a long term approach to both meeting some immediate needs and then also some systemic changes that can better position our network. Looking ahead to rising need with the demographic changes that we talked about and how we can be best positioned to serve more seniors in need.
mhm. How much of this, also might be working to align Meals on Wheels more with, healthcare directly and also kind of the food as medicine movement? Like, tell me a little bit about like what I mean, maybe this gift isn't necessarily going to be used for that, but tell me how some of those efforts are also being reflected in the work that Meals on Wheels America and its members are doing.
Yeah, so there's definitely been, and you've probably talked about it in past episodes of Substack here, growing movement around food as medicine, medically
Mhm.
tailored meals, and so it's a really exciting time with more possibilities, particularly with funding that can be attached to it. I think what's particularly exciting is a growing recognition about the impact of good nutrition on health and ways that that can be leveraged for good. So there are in some states the Medicaid waivers, the Section 1115 waivers that have enabled Medicaid payments to pay for medically tailored meals. There
Mhm.
are other places where healthcare providers are more actively involved in the space, whether that's referrals upon discharge for medically tailored meals or some longer term opportunities. We certainly have members of the Meals on Wheels America network that are involved. There's I'd say a wide variation, but many are involved in providing medically tailored meals as part of their offerings, and I think that is helpful in just recognizing the diverse and whole needs of seniors and trying to help them to live the healthiest, best lives that they can, with providing meals that can help them to do that. So there's, um, you know, even amidst a very tight fiscal environment, there's some different opportunities to find funding and to find support for doing this,
Yeah.
and some interesting bipartisan support for that.
Well, I love to hear that. It's bipartisan, and I love to hear that the support is growing. I'll ask you, um, after this next question, which how our viewers and subscribers can help support older adults in their communities, whether it's through advocating for some of the things that you've alluded to, or more directly in their programs. But I don't want to end this edition without mentioning that. So this month is the 20th anniversary of Jewish American Heritage Month. Um, Previously, you worked, for decades in Jewish organizations before coming to Meals on Wheels, including Mazone, a Jewish response to end hunger. I know that something that we've shared over the decades of our friendship is how our faith, even though I'm not Jewish, a good Episcopalian over here, provided we can be good. Um, and your Jewish faith have both kind of driven us to be active in this field and be the advocates that we are. So I'd love to hear more just, about how your Jewish values led you to this work, and not only how they led you to this work, but how do they keep you in the fight? I mean, you're talking about like the right to food and how we need to create entitlements, and that's going to be a while, unless we get really lucky, um, which I hope we do get lucky. But there's got to be something sustaining you in this fight to these big audacious goals, and I think your faith is part of it. So tell us more about that.
Well, thank you for the question on this. I never intended to go down the career path that I've gone down. And I feel extremely fortunate. I've spent a good part of my career in the Jewish social justice world.
Mhm,
Um, and I think social justice values have been really central to my sense of Jewish identity. I think in Judaism, there's a lot of focus on our responsibility to act, to take action, to help repair the brokenness of our world.
mhm,
There's a recognition that our world is broken, and that there's a responsibility of individuals in partnership with God. Actually, the blessing we say for a meal for bread, say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ruach haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. We thank God who brings forth bread from the earth. Well, bread doesn't come from the earth by itself. Like there's not a well, there is a bread tree, but there's bread doesn't emerge from the ground. It's our partnership. It's man's partnership
mhm,
with creation to find sustenance for ourselves, and um, I think I've just always been drawn to that sense of responsibility. In Jewish tradition, in the ethics of our fathers, Pirkei Avot, there's a famous teaching that we're not required to complete the task, but neither are we able to desist from it. Like
Mm,
we can't finish something, but we can't walk away from it. And I
yeah.
think um, maybe to your point about why you stay engaged when it's tough and when victory doesn't seem like it's achievable in the short term, there's a sense that toward things that really matter, you stay engaged in the fight. And
Mhm,
sometimes you don't get the solace of quick wins or a lot of reassurance, but you stay at it. Um,
mhm,
yeah, and uh, I think another kind of reflection from Jewish tradition in Deuteronomy, and I've talked about this in anti-hunger circles a lot. There's a commandment about setting aside the corners of our fields,
mhm,
right? And that meant something at a time when most people were farmers, when they had fields that they could physically do that with. Well, we're not in a society where that's the case. So, what does that mean for us in today's America? I would contend that the federal government, through our tax dollars and through programs like SNAP
mhm.
and Older Americans Act and child nutrition programs, that's that fulfillment of that kind of biblical responsibility to preserve the dignity of people around us,
Absolutely.
and enable them to be able to provide for themselves so that they don't go without. Um, and that's an appropriate role for our federal government. And to me, that's something it's not exclusively Jewish. I mean, I kind of see that connection through Jewish tradition, but I think across faith traditions, there's that similar kind of calling. So yeah, I feel really blessed that I've been able to spend my career working on causes that I care about that reflect my values of the world that I'd like to live in,
Mhm.
and give me the opportunity to roll up my sleeves and try to work toward bringing that closer, even if it feels far away.
Yeah, yeah. I what I like about that second passage you shared, uh, is the implication too that we didn't start the fight, right? We didn't start it either. It started before we were here. We're not the first ones to show up and suddenly think, that there needs to be justice for our neighbors, that we need to end food insecurity and all of that. And so it's not only that we don't have a responsibility to finish it per se, but we do have a responsibility to keep up the fights that are worth having that our ancestors had before us, right?
There are 2 lines, they're not right next to each other, but 2 lines in I think it's in Deuteronomy. Um, "There shall be no needy amongst you,
Mhm,
and there will always be needy, amongst you." And I'm getting the quotes not exactly right, but there there's a tension there, right? Like, they both can't be true, and yet they both are true. Like,
mhm,
there shouldn't be needy among us, and that's what we work toward. And there's also the reality that there always will be needy amongst us. So what do we do with those 2 things? You know, we could be paralyzed and feel like, I'm gonna throw my hands up, there's nothing I can do.
yeah,
Or you can accept the reality and say, "This is how things are. I'm gonna work and do what I can so that it's closer toward the way things should be." Knowing that we're never going to fully get to that point,
mhm,
that the world is broken. There's always tough shit that we have to deal with, and that doesn't relieve us of the need to do what we can.
absolutely, absolutely, we will always have that responsibility. Um, which is a great dovetail into our final question. So you have hopefully inspired many of our viewers, either live or in the future recording, um, on how to act, on how to support the older adults in their communities, and how to support the great advocacy that you and Meals on Wheels America and your local programs are doing. So, with that, what's our charge? How can our viewers and subscribers help support the older adults in their lives and the efforts of Meals on Wheels America?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about these issues that I care a lot about, and
Mhm.
thank you for all that you do for food security and for these important causes. Um, I think there's a few ways folks can get involved. If so, on our website, and you can go to endthewait.com, which is our
That's
campaign website,
endthewait.com.
or which will take you to mealsonwheelsamerica.org. But endthewait.com is our campaign website. We're trying to end the wait for seniors.
Mhm.
So there's certainly opportunities to add your voice for increased funding for the Older Americans Act nutrition program. So we'd love for folks to advocate with us. Certainly, they can make donations to help support the network or their local programs, and to volunteer. And you can find links to do all of those things on our website. And volunteering, I think, is such a powerful thing to do.
Mm,
That human connection. If you have the opportunity to volunteer with the Meals on Wheels program and have a regular route and get to know seniors in your community,
mm,
um, I often hear from people that volunteers get more out of it than they feel like they're giving back to the seniors. And um, I think to brighten the day for somebody who is alone and maybe doesn't have a lot of brightness in their day typically, that's a beautiful thing to be able to do. So, lots of ways to connect and to give back, and I just ask people to help prioritize seniors that just don't get the kind of respect and attention that they need writ large. So, Older Americans Month is a nice reminder about the opportunities to do that.
absolutely. Well, Josh, thank you so much for all that you do, for all Meals on Wheels America does, and just for being you and for being the friend you have over the last many many years that we won't enumerate here. Um, Thanks again for being here. For those of you who have been watching, thank you for being here. We hope you learned something, and you now have a to-do list of lots of advocacy to do, including you, Karen, who we know you're already in that fight. But thanks so much for being here, and we will see you when we see you next. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Will.
Bye.
Bye bye.